Okay, so as you've probably been realizing, camouflaging is probably one of my focused interests or my special interests. So I'm going to come back and tell you a little bit more about the work we've been doing, because my contention is that camouflaging is a really, really important part of many autistic people's day-to-day lives and experience. I think in particular it's an important part of the lives and experiences of autistic girls and women. So if we want to understand how we can help autistic girls and women, we need to know more about camouflaging. So, as I said, camouflaging we define as masking, compensation, putting on my best normal. And again, I've got another of these pairs of clips, these kind of longitudinal clips from somebody who we'll call HM when they first came to the clinic age 15. And then very kindly agreed to come back and to talk with us and to help us use these videos for sort of training purposes. And so, again, you'll quickly see this is a very articulate and thoughtful person, but I think the reason I'm playing their clips now is that they convey a lot about camouflaging in particular, but also other elements of the kind of experience of being autistic and female. So this is HM, interviewed by one of my friends and colleagues, Mariana Murin, age 15, and then we're going to meet them again a little bit later. Okay, so there she is at 15. Now, 5 years later, HM now identifies as Felix and is going to talk to us. He's going to offer us his insights further on the sort of the position, I suppose, of females on the autism spectrum, including on camouflaging. Yeah, so I'm going to go on now to kind of actually, I'm going to end up expanding on actually, that was a very rich bit of sort of text. I thought there's a lot in there, but I'm going to expand on that a bit by talking about this study. It was done by my PhD student Laura Hull and various other people, which, as I've said already, was called Putting on My Best Normal. So this was a study with 92 autistic adults who gave text into a web survey, and we did a qualitative analysis of those data using thematic analysis. And we were interested in the nature of camouflaging, which I'm not going to talk about much here because I've already talked about that, but the causes and the consequences of camouflaging. So Laura eventually came up with this fairly elaborate thematic framework, and again, the paper's open access, so I do recommend sort of downloading it and having a look at it. But let's have a think. So this part of the thematic map concerns motivations for camouflaging. This is the kind of why part of the analysis. Why do people camouflage? And in particular, there were two kind of overarching themes. One we ended up calling assimilation. So there's something about the need to fit in, I suppose. Often, as I'll say in a minute, an enforced need to fit in, an externally enforced need to fit in. And then the other one was called, again, based on the actual text of one person's quotation, to know and be known, to form relationships, to bridge between people, to relate. So here are some quotes that relate to those themes, and I think they're quite powerful. Why do people camouflage? Camouflaging helps to survive in school and college, and it's important for keeping jobs, says this woman, this 27-year-old woman. And I think this is the one that really hit me between the eyes. Why do you camouflage? I want to avoid the bullying, mostly. You know, I think it's very, very striking. You know, if we were doing a study of, for example, why in a certain country do gay men in certain situations pretend not to be gay, there would be no question that you would just say, well, this is about discrimination, this is about victimization, and this shouldn't be expected of them. So, you know, I do think there's a very interesting political element to this here, which is, you know, the people in the study, some of them are telling us that essentially camouflaging is something that's enforced upon them by the very difficult experiences of being autistic in a world that's predominantly neurotypical, and the kind of victimization and bullying that sometimes results for that. So, no, I think I found that very striking, that quote. It's not entirely a kind of negative story, if you like. So other people felt more, if you like, more positive motivations for camouflaging. So it enables me to be with other people in a way that's relatively comfortable for me and for them. So there is something about, you know, as I said before, kind of bridging. So what about the consequences of camouflaging? What did people tell us about the effect that camouflaging had on them? Well, one idea was that actually by camouflaging, some autistic people felt that they almost, because they were camouflaging and weren't presenting regularly as their kind of authentic autistic selves, they were therefore not challenging simplistic stereotypes about what autism is. So that was what perceived to be one sort of negative consequence of camouflaging. The main one, I think, was one that was, again, we've used the language of one of our participants here, was this theme called I Fall to Pieces. This sense about the anxiety and the exhaustion that can be associated with camouflaging. And then there was another theme, I'm not my true self. This notion that if you spend a lot of time pretending to be quite different to who you really are, that can have undermining effects upon your identity. So again, some quotes to sum this up. I mean, so this is somebody who described themselves as other gender, so they didn't identify as male or female, a 30-year-old. It's exhausting. I feel the need to seek solitude so I can be myself and not have to think about how I'm perceived by others. And that's certainly a very common experience that I hear about with camouflaging. We've talked about this already, the way it can get in the way of being diagnosed with autism. Interestingly, one person, in fact more than one person, so this 28-year-old woman said people need to learn how to drop the camouflage when in situations such as medical assessments or dealing with support professionals. So there was an idea that it cut people off from getting support and could even interfere with kind of care that isn't just about autism. You know, so if people are always sort of determined, they feel obliged to put on this kind of front and that everything's fine, that can get in the way of open communication with physicians and so on. And then I thought this was a very sort of poetic, really, expression of that whole kind of identity issue, I feel as though I've lost track of who I really am, and that my actual self is floating somewhere above me like a balloon. So really, from this study, and it's just a qualitative study, so it's, qualitative studies aren't there to test hypotheses or to say, is this variable associated with that variable? Is amount of camouflaging associated with quality of life? They can't do that. That's not what they're designed for. What they can do is kind of map the terrain and generate ideas. So, but my sense from this, and an idea I'd like to test out, is that actually, for many people, not for everybody, of course, but for many people, actually the consequences of camouflaging, whereas the causes of camouflaging seem to be quite mixed and include some sort of more, in quotes, positive motivations, as well as some really quite pernicious ones, like the avoiding bullying. In terms of the consequences, we heard quite a lot of kind of negative comments, really, on the consequences of camouflaging. And that certainly seems to me something that we need to investigate, building on this qualitative work, using a more quantitative framework where you really can, test hypotheses or ask questions like, do people who camouflage more tend to report, higher social anxiety or lower quality of life, and so on. But of course, to do those studies, you need to be able to measure camouflaging. And so that's what we've set about trying to do. We've developed a measure of camouflaging, which after many hours of deliberation, we called the CAT-Q, Camouflaging of Autistic Traits Questionnaire. Although I'm quite, given the conversation about cats we had earlier, I'm feeling that's quite serendipitous. So this is a self-report measure. It's based upon not the previous approaches I mentioned, where you try and work out discrepancies between someone's how autistic they are and how they present in certain situations. This is about just asking people, based on our quite careful mapping of camouflaging in our qualitative work, questions about whether they use certain behaviors, whether they attempt to camouflage, to mask, to compensate, and so on. It has 25 items. And again, I need to give a sort of, you need to treat these findings with appropriate caution, because this is a paper that's currently under review, so it hasn't received the kind of stamp of passing peer review and being published. So these are provisional findings I'm talking about here. But we've recruited on the internet 350 autistic participants, of whom 191 are female, 471 non-autistic participants, and we've given them the questionnaire and done various things to try and work out whether the questionnaire is very good, any good from their data. So the questionnaire measures overall camouflaging, but it has 3 subscales. Compensation, I've talked about that already. Masking, I've talked about that. From our factor analysis, we came out with a third element of camouflaging, which we weren't particularly expecting, and which, after, again, some head scratching, we called assimilation. So to give you a sense of what these scales measure, so compensation, one of the compensation questions is, I've spent time learning social skills from television shows and films and try to use these in interactions. Yeah, that's one of the questions on the compensation scale. The masking scale, an example question, is I monitor my body language and facial expressions so that I appear interested by the person I'm interacting with. And then the assimilation scale is kind of about people kind of almost having to force themselves to socially interact and to appear sort of socially engaged when they don't actually always feel like it. So I have to force myself to interact with people when I'm in social situations. And our initial findings are that the instrument possesses what we call reliability, so scores on it are fairly consistent over time, which implies that there's not lots and lots of error kind of washing around, causing people's scores to fluctuate. And some initial evidence for validity, i.e. this notion of does it measure what it says it's measuring. Well, firstly, it was based on this qualitative analysis, so it quite carefully maps onto the construct. But we also found, which I think would be consistent with what we'd expect from a true measure of camouflaging, that it's associated certainly with being autistic. So autistic people report higher levels of camouflaging than non-autistic people. But even amongst those of autism, those with higher or self-reported autistic traits tended to report more camouflaging. And again, I think supportive of the validity of this measure is that females score higher than males on it, and that includes within the autism group. And that's you could see from this graph, so the green bars, so higher scores, so literally higher up scores indicate more camouflaging. that this side of the graph, the green bars, depicts the female scores on the measure. The blue bars depict the male scores on the measure. So the average score for females was higher. It's kind of medium effect size. But I suppose the other thing you can see is that there's still quite a lot of overlap. So whilst definitely camouflaging, social camouflaging, based on this finding, but based on other findings, is a key part of the female autism phenotype, I think we should just remind ourselves that lots and lots of autistic males do it too. I suppose this goes back to my point right about the beginning about not wanting to make too much generalizations, and that actually a lot of what we learn about camouflaging for females will be relevant to some males as well. Now, with this instrument, we're planning to go on and discover more about the consequences of camouflaging. And we're currently doing a study where we're interested in, for example, the extent to which camouflaging maps onto people attaining certain academic and occupational goals that they set themselves, or the prediction that it should promote that. But what's intriguing, and again, these are rather initial analyses, but I thought I'd share them with you in the interest of letting you know kind of what we're up to and where the field might be going in the next year or two. It was interesting to note that even when we controlled for autism trait severity in the autism group, higher camouflaging scores are essentially associated with higher self-reported depression and higher anxiety and social anxiety. So again, I'd be very interested. I mean, this is clearly, it's unclear quite how these relationships work. But when we're asking this overall question, is camouflaging good or bad? When a young girl receives an autism diagnosis, should we be encouraging her to camouflage, or should we be discouraging her to camouflage, or should we encourage her to find aspects of camouflaging that she finds useful and others that she doesn't? I think we need to learn more about the sort of consequences of camouflaging, and I'd love to hear from everyone, but particularly from autistic people in the audience on that matter.